What was it like on the set of Little House on the Prairie? The actress who played Michael Landon's wife says it wasn't as wholesome as it seemed.
Guess what me and Andrew found?
Where have you been, young lady? You're late.
Huh?
I asked you where you've been.
Well, I was trying to tell you, me and Andrew.
Fact is, you're late.
Behind every soft-focus sunset and every heartfelt family lesson on Little House on the Prairie, there existed a parallel world of real people dealing with real friendships, real rivalries, real addictions, and real heartbreak, a world that audiences never saw but that shaped almost everything that ended up on screen. And to understand the show fully, it helps to start with one of its most surprising truths, which is that the two girls who spent 9 seasons hating each other on camera, Laura Ingalls and Nellie Olson, played by Melissa Gilbert and Allison Arngrim, were actually some of the closest friends on the entire set, spending their free time together, attending sleepovers, and treating their on-screen feud almost like a long-running comedy routine that only they were truly in on, and this playful streak extended into Nellie's eventual on-screen marriage to a character named Percival, portrayed by actor Tracy, who in real life was gay, a detail that never stopped him, and Arngrim from throwing themselves into exaggerated romantic scenes, often turning kisses into theatrical performances designed less for the cameras and more for the reaction of their friend Melissa Gilbert, who, still very young and inexperienced when it came to romance, found these displays both embarrassing and overwhelming, a discomfort that mirrored her own real struggles with the show's romantic storylines, especially when it came to her character's relationship with Almanzo Wilder, played by Dean Butler, since Melissa was only 15 when she filmed her first on-screen kiss, an experience that also happened to be her very first kiss in real life, and the noticeable age gap between her and Butler made the moment so uncomfortable that she eventually confided in the person she trusted most on set, Michael Landon, who wasn't just her co-star but also acted as a director and, in many ways, a father figure, and Landon, recognizing how genuinely anxious she was, brought the issue directly to the producers, who agreed to soften the scene by replacing the kiss with a simple peck on the cheek, a small but telling example of how much quiet negotiation went into shaping even the gentlest moments viewers saw at home, and Landon's influence on the show went far beyond moments like this, since he wasn't only the beloved patriarch Charles Ingalls but also one of its primary writers, directors, and producers, eventually directing 90 of the show's 204 episodes and shaping the storylines for both its original pilot and its emotional series finale. Yet behind his warm, dependable image as a father figure both on and off screen, Landon was quietly dealing with a serious dependency on alcohol, a struggle that, according to Melissa Gilbert's memoir, began early each morning with a coffee secretly mixed with liquor and continued steadily throughout the day, often without most of the cast realizing the full extent of it, and Landon wasn't the only one, since the crew reportedly went through enormous amounts of beer during long shooting days, with particularly intense days earning the nickname 3-case days, a sharp contrast to the wholesome, family-friendly tone the show presented to audiences across the country, and just as unexpected as this hidden struggle is the truth about Landon's own background, since while his character Charles Ingalls often delivered gentle messages rooted in Christian values, Landon himself was born Eugene Maurice Orowitz, the son of a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, raised in New York and New Jersey, where he celebrated his bar mitzvah and identified culturally with his father's Jewish heritage, even though he never strongly committed to any organized religion, describing himself as someone who believed in God in a general sense but didn't feel bound to a specific faith. A quiet personal contradiction sitting just beneath the surface of a show often associated with traditional religious themes, and even something as small as Landon's signature curly hair turned out to be more complicated than fans realized, since his natural hair color was a duller, ashy brown rather than the rich brunette seen on screen, meaning his iconic look came courtesy of regular professional dye jobs, and as he began developing natural gray hairs, the combination of studio lighting and dye created an odd purplish tint that required specialized colorists to correct, just one more small detail revealing how much effort went into maintaining the show's polished visual identity, and that polished identity, surprisingly, never stopped the show from tackling genuinely difficult subject matter, since despite its reputation as gentle family viewing, Little House on the Prairie frequently explored themes such as sexual assault, addiction, racism, prejudice, adoption, and disability, topics that many other shows of the era avoided entirely, placing it well ahead of its time in terms of storytelling courage even as its sunny exterior suggested otherwise, and family relationships off-screen carried their own complicated layers as well, particularly in the case of Jonathan Gilbert, who played Nellie's younger brother Willie, and who in real life was the adopted brother of Melissa Gilbert, a relationship that seemed close during the show's run but eventually grew distant afterward, as Jonathan left acting behind entirely to become a stockbroker in New York, while Melissa continued working in Entertainment, later becoming president of the Screen Actors Guild and even running for a congressional seat in Michigan in 2016, a campaign she was ultimately forced to abandon due to injuries from an earlier accident, and while some sibling-like relationships faded quietly, others were marked by open tension from the very beginning. Most notably the relationship between Melissa Gilbert and Melissa Sue Anderson, who played sisters Laura and Mary Ingalls, whose close on-screen bond completely disappeared the moment filming stopped, with the two actresses reportedly disliking each other throughout the entire 9-year run of the show, a feud that, according to Melissa Gilbert's memoir, Prairie, stemmed from what she described as Anderson's cold and distant personality, though Anderson herself has never publicly responded, leaving fans to wonder whether her sheltered upbringing simply left her unprepared for the close, fast-paced environment of a busy television production, and, despite these underlying tensions, the overall mood on set was often surprisingly playful. Largely thanks to Michael Landon's well-known love of practical jokes, which became something of a set tradition, including one famous prank involving saran wrap stretched tightly across a toilet seat, a classic gag Landon apparently enjoyed pulling on unsuspecting crew members whenever the opportunity arose, and according to Rachel Greenbush, who played the youngest Ingalls' daughter Carrie, Landon's mischievous side went even further, since she and Melissa Gilbert would sneak off during breaks to catch frogs near a nearby creek, only to bring their slippery discoveries back to set and hand them over to Landon, who would then hide the frogs in his mouth before approaching unsuspecting cast and crew members, suddenly opening his mouth to let the startled frog leap free, sending everyone nearby into fits of laughter and panic, a perfect snapshot of a cast that took their work seriously but never themselves. And speaking of laughter, the show is filled with bloopers and continuity errors that have become beloved among longtime fans over the decades, perhaps none more famous than the strange timeline of Laura's pregnancy, which according to Melissa Gilbert and longtime fansite operator Lenny Parker, stretched across more than a year in the show's internal timeline, beginning in one warm season and somehow continuing into the following summer without explanation. A comedic inconsistency no one on the production seemed particularly concerned about at the time, and even more surprising is the appearance of Colonel Sanders, founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, in a Season 8 episode titled Wave of the Future, where Nellie's restaurant becomes part of a franchise deal involving a fictionalized Colonel Sanders offering Harriet her own chicken business, despite the fact that the real Colonel Sanders wasn't born until 1890, and Kentucky Fried Chicken itself wasn't founded until 1952. Decades after the show's setting in the 1870s and 1880s, a wonderfully absurd anachronism that still amuses fans rewatching the series today, and in another memorable moment from Season 5's episode, The Odyssey, a tense scene involving an attempted attack on a moving train takes a sudden comedic turn when viewers can clearly see a dummy being thrown from the train instead of an actual stunt performer, who can then be seen separately rolling down the hill nearby, completely upstaging the motionless prop beside him, and beyond these dramatic bloopers, smaller continuity quirks have become cherished Easter eggs for devoted viewers, such as mysterious tree branches that appear to rustle outside the girl's bedroom window in certain episodes, despite no such tree existing near the house in any other scene, likely the result of reused sound effects or stock footage meant to create atmosphere. And then there's the case of the wandering family quilt, a mostly white quilt with a double wedding ring pattern that somehow appears on multiple different beds throughout the series, suggesting that props and costumes were frequently reused across different sets without much concern for consistency, and clothing itself became another unintentional source of historical inaccuracy, since several characters, including Caroline Ingalls, are shown wearing bras, an item that wouldn't be invented until 1912, decades after the show's setting, while some of the women's hairstyles feature perms that look distinctly more like the 1970s than the 1880s, with even Melissa Gilbert later admitting that her hair often looked far too modern and stylish for the character she was portraying. And one particularly delightful story involves a Reddit user known as Gorosaurus Rex, who had long been bothered by a confusing storyline involving the character Albert, whose fate seemed to shift between dying in a made-for-TV movie and later returning as the town's doctor, an inconsistency so persistent that this fan's partner arranged a surprise anniversary gift in the form of a personalized video message from Melissa Gilbert herself, who humorously addressed the confusion by joking that perhaps Albert really did die, only to return to Walnut Grove as a friendly neighborhood zombie doctor, a light-hearted resolution to a mystery that had puzzled fans for years. And the show's most significant continuity issue, however, appears in its very final episode, The Last Farewell, set in the year 1901, more than a decade after the events of the previous season, meaning that by this point, most of the adult characters should have aged into their 60s and 70s, with the real Charles Ingalls passing away just a year later in 1902, and the show's youngest characters should have grown into young adults, yet on screen, almost no one appears to have aged at all, creating a strange sense of frozen time that still puzzles viewers comparing the finale to earlier seasons, where Laura's voiceover specifically references the year 1887, 14 years before the events of the finale, and yet the characters seem to have aged only slightly during that span. And behind all of these stories sits the larger, more emotional narrative of Michael Landon himself, born Eugene Maurice Orowitz on October 31, 1936, in Forest Hills, Queens, before his family moved to Collingswood, New Jersey, where he grew up under difficult circumstances, particularly due to his mother's struggles with suicidal thoughts, including one terrifying incident during a family beach vacation where she attempted to drown herself, only for young Landon to rescue her. A trauma that contributed to his childhood struggles with bedwetting, a detail made even more painful by the fact that, according to an unauthorized biography, his mother publicly displayed his wet sheets outside the window for neighbors to see, and despite this difficult upbringing, Landon went on to build an extraordinary career, first achieving fame on the long-running Western Bonanza alongside stars like Lorne Greene and Dan Blocker, before becoming the driving creative force behind Little House on the Prairie, ultimately leaving behind a personal fortune that, while estimated at around $1 million at the time of his passing, allowed him to leave between $8 and $10 million to each of his 9 children, a final act of generosity meant to prevent future conflict among them, and his legacy continued through his son, Michael Landon Jr., who became a successful producer and director in his own right, while his co-stars went on to live far more modest financial lives, with Karen Grassel, who played matriarch Caroline Ingalls, settling around $500,000 despite continuing to work in film, and Melissa Gilbert similarly reporting a net worth near $500,000, her journey marked by both professional triumphs and personal hardships, including her later foray into politics, while sisters Lindsay and Sydney Greenbush, who together portrayed young Carrie Ingalls, were reported to have a combined net worth somewhere between $1 and $5 million, and in the end, despite the laughter, the friendships, the rivalries, the bloopers, and the personal struggles that unfolded far from the cameras, Little House on the Prairie remains a beloved piece of television history, a show that managed to be both deeply flawed in its production and deeply meaningful to the millions of viewers who grew up watching the Ingalls family navigate hardship with grace, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate new generations of fans who, decades later, are still discovering just how complicated and human the real story behind the Prairie truly was.